What is up, everyone? It's Quinn here, and in today's video, I'm going to be going through my Week 13 top 40 wide receiver rankings, splitting these guys up into different tiers. This week definitely feels pretty stacked at pretty much every position because we do not have any bye weeks. So let's just dive right into the rankings here. Starting off in tier 1, you're going to go with Nico Collins here as my top dog. It's a nice matchup. The Jaguars are allowing the third most points per game to the wide receiver position. He's coming off a big week 12, 5 for 92 and a touchdown. Seems like he's fully back here. Nico Collins, my wide receiver 1 this week. Then I have A.J. Brown going up against the Ravens, also coming off of a really strong week 12, and then also a great matchup. The Ravens are allowing the most points per game to the wide receiver position. Then we're going to go with Jamar Chase going up against the Steelers. Not a very good matchup. The Steelers are allowing the fifth fewest points per game to the wide receiver position, but it's Jamar Chase. He's been a monster all season long. Bengals still have a pretty high 24.5 point implied point total, so I think Jamar Chase will be just fine. And then rounding out this tier with the two Rams wide receivers, when they're both healthy and on the field together, they both continue to produce at a very high level. They also have a nice matchup here. The Saints are top 6 in points per game allowed to the wide receiver position, and the Rams are top 6 in implied points this week. So Puka, Cooper Kupp, both fitting in here to tier 1. Now moving into tier 2, going to start off with Justin Jefferson going up against the Cardinals. And he's kind of been on a little bit of a cold stretch here. He has not hit 15 PPR points in any of his last 3 games. Week 12, by far his worst game of the season. Only 2 receptions for 27 yards. But this is still Justin Jefferson. You know, teams can throw everything at him, but then you're going to have huge games from Jordan Addison, TJ Hawkinson. I really don't have a ton of concerns for Jefferson moving forward. Then I have Amon-Ra St. Brown going up against the Bears. It's not a great matchup here. The Bears are bottom 6 in points per game allowed to wide receivers, but Amon-Ra has just been a super steady option. The wide receiver 5 in points per game. Maybe not getting like the extreme volume we were anticipating, but this Lions offense has just been so good. The efficiency has been there. He's getting into the end zone. Still a locked-in wide receiver 1. Then I'm going to go with CeeDee Lamb going up against the Giants. I think his production has been, I guess, somewhat encouraging without Dak. 14.6 points per game. That's 3 games with Cooper Rush as the starter. And that's 14.6 PPR points per game without getting into the end zone. So he is just getting force-fed, 34 targets. Obviously, the ceiling is going to be a little bit lower. That touchdown upside isn't going to be there. But I still think he is a solid wide receiver 1 play with the volume he is getting. A few more guys in this tier. We have Mike Evans going up against the Panthers. In his return game, 5 receptions for 68 yards. Just a pretty solid performance. Also a decent matchup here against the Panthers. Then we have Courtland Sutton breaking in here into the top 10, going up against the Browns. Courtland Sutton and Bo Nix have just been on absolute heaters. He's averaging 20.8 points per game in his last 5. He has put up at least 14 PPR points in each of those 5 games. So I think Courtland Sutton definitely belongs here in tier 2. And then the final tier 2 wide receiver, it is T. Higgins. And when this man has been on the field, he's been balling out. He is the wide receiver 6 in points per game. He has struggled to kind of stay out there, but when he's playing, the dude is balling out. I think he belongs here as a wide receiver 1, even in a pretty tough matchup here against the Steelers. Now moving into tier 3, going to start off this tier with Terry McLaurin going up against the Titans. I will say this was looking like it was going to be a rough game in week 12. Ends up scoring like a huge, long, deep touchdown, which, you know, that was great for his fantasy value. I'm not going to nitpick it, right? Because, you know, all the points matter. Garbage time matters. He has still been pretty consistent on, you know, a scoring basis, 15 plus points in 6 of his last 7 games. Commanders offense looking a little bit sketchier as of late, but I still think he's playable here in like this fringe wide receiver 1 area. After Terry, going to go with George Pickens going up against the Bengals. We now have a 5-game sample size of Pickens with Russell Wilson. In those 5 games, he is averaging 15.9 points per game. This is probably where he's going to settle in like the high-end wide receiver 2 range, maybe with bye weeks, injuries. It's like a back-end wide receiver 1, but 5-game sample size with solid production. Feel good about George Pickens. At wide receiver 14, I have Drake London going up against the Chargers. This honestly is just where he's like slotted it on the season. He's the wide receiver 14 in points per game. Not a terrible matchup, not a great matchup, just pretty much in line with, you know, how he's been producing this season. At wide receiver 15, I have Malik Nabers. I think some people are going to think maybe this is a little bit high. He definitely hasn't had these super high ceiling games as of late. But in his first game with Tommy DeVito, 9 targets, 6 receptions for 64 yards. The problem here for Neighbors is not the volume. He's getting force fed. He's giving you decent yardage, nothing crazy, but pretty consistent PPR production. He's getting to double digit points. The dude can just not get into the end zone. He has not scored a touchdown since week 3. That is somewhat concerning, but as long as the volume's there, it's almost like a CD Lamb situation where it's like, if you're force feeding him, he's going to give you something, and then you're just hoping, he can score a couple touchdowns, like 3 touchdowns rest of season. After Neighbors, going to go with Tyreek Hill going up against the Packers. I kind of feel like we have enough of a sample size here with a healthy Tua, where I don't know if Tyreek Hill is going to be that wide receiver 1 rest of season. He definitely could be if he hits in the touchdown department, but I think 6 or 7 game sample size with Tua, he's averaging 15.3 points per game, and that's fine as probably a higher end wide receiver 2, but that's definitely not the elite high end wide receiver 1 that you drafted him to be. After Tyreek Hill, going to go with JSN going up against the Jets. This is not a good matchup, but JSN has been on an absolute tear. In his last 3 games, he has put up 37, 21.8, and 19.7 PPR points. And then the final guy in this tier is going to be Ladd McConkey going up against the Falcons. Another nice matchup here had the Ravens last week. This week he has the Falcons. They're allowing the 4th most points per game to the wide receiver position. He has been very productive in his last 2 games, 6 for 123, 6 for 83. I think if last night told us anything about this Chargers offense, this Chargers passing attack, Ladd McConkey, we knew he was the clear-cut number 1 weapon, but he is just infinitely better than any other pass catcher they have on that roster. That Monday night game was just a Quentin Johnston disaster class. Joshua Palmer is just a guy, right? He's not going to be a, game winner for you. So Ladd McConkey, the clear-cut top weapon here. Justin Herbert's having a great season in a great matchup. I think he's a really nice mid-tier wide receiver too. Now moving into tier 4, going to start off this tier with Calvin Ridley going up against the Commanders. He has been really solid over his last 5 games, 16.7 points per game. Since Will Levis has come back from injury, he's looked pretty decent in his last 3. Not like he's a top 10 quarterback or anything, but he's providing the volume. Calvin Ridley is taking advantage of it. After Ridley, going to go with DK Metcalf going up against the Jets. They're allowing the 3rd fewest points per game to the wide receiver position, and this is just kind of where DK Metcalf has settled in. On the season, he is the wide receiver 20 in points per game. I kind of thought that with DK Metcalf coming back from his knee injury, I thought we would see JSN kind of take a step back, DK Metcalf go back to the production we saw pre-injury. It's kind of been the opposite, through 2 games with him back, where DK Metcalf has kind of taken the back seat and JSN has continued to ball out. So we'll see if that continues. I'm guessing their production is going to even out. Maybe DK Metcalf ends up outproducing him rest of season, but just the way we've been trending over the last couple of weeks, JSN does seem to be the better play. Then I have Jacoby Myers going up against the Chiefs. Jacoby Myers deserves a lot of respect here. You have Devontae Adams go down. He's now thrust into the clear wide receiver 1 spot. The quarterback play has been a question mark all season long, and all he has done is produce game after game. We have a 7-game sample size of him without Devontae Adams. He is averaging 15.8 points per game. Now, it's not a good matchup here against the Chiefs. The Raiders have a very, very low implied point total. But Jacoby Myers, even in lower scoring games against tough matchups like he had last week against the Broncos, he's still putting up points. I like him as a back-end wide receiver too. A couple more guys in this tier. We have Garrett Wilson going up against the Seahawks. In the games where he's playing with Devontae Adams, he's averaging 14.9 points per game. So pretty fair for this back-end wide receiver 2 spot. And then the last guy in this tier, Darnell Mooney, going up against the Chargers. He is dealing with a hamstring injury coming off the bye week. Hopefully he's good to go for this one. On the season, he is the wide receiver 24 in points per game, so pretty in line with this ranking here. Now looking at tier 5, going to start off this tier with actually another guy dealing with a hamstring injury. It is Devonta Smith. He missed last week with that injury. I hope he can get back because it's a really nice matchup here against the Ravens. Talked about it with A.J. Brown. They're allowing the most points per game to the wide receiver position. We're just kind of hoping he can get healthy for this one. Then I have Zay Flowers in that same matchup. He's the wide receiver 24 in points per game. Kind of interesting here for Flowers because through the first 10 weeks, he had just been the definition of boomer bust, Week 1, I think he had like a, mid-level game. And then since then, it was either, he's under 8 points or he's exploding for like 16 plus. We actually have back-to-back just like average games for him, 11.9 and 11.2 PPR points. He still has that high ceiling. It's not a very good matchup here against the Eagles, but I think he's fine in like that fringe wide receiver 2 territory. After Flowers, going to go with Jerry Jeudy going up against the Broncos. The Broncos are allowing the second fewest points per game to the wide receiver position. But, Jameis coming in, he just continues to feed these weapons. They're getting a lot of volume. They're being force-fed targets, and, they're delivering for fantasy. Jerry Jeudy is averaging 17 PPR points per game in his last 4. You're hoping he avoids the Surtain matchup, but like we saw last week, Jacoby Myers, I'm honestly not sure, how heavily he was guarded by Surtain, but, either he was producing on him or he was not drawing that tough matchup. Both those things could be the case for Jerry Jeudy. Then I have Khalil Shakir going up against the 49ers. Dude has just been the definition of consistency, 10 plus PPR points in 9 of his 10 games. We still have like just kind of uncertainty at the wide receiver position where Keon Coleman was injured heading into the bye week. We have Amari Cooper, who hasn't really broken out. So Khalil Shakir has just continued to operate here as the top dog, especially fantasy-wise. So I think he's a fine play here against the Niners. Then I have Devontae Adams. In his, I think, 5 games with the Jets, he's averaging 12 points per game. Nothing crazy, kind of underwhelming. I think he will improve on that moving forward, but going to have to see a little bit of it. Maybe out of the bye week, they look better. Then I have J-Mo going up against the Bears. Last 2 really solid games, 4 for 124 and a touchdown, 5 for 64. Not the best matchup against the Bears, but all it takes is one big play for J-Mo to pretty much, earn his starting spot in your lineup. Then I have DJ Moore in that same matchup. The Lions are 9th in points per game allowed. In his last 2 since Shane Waldron's been gone, he's had back-to-back solid performances, 7 for 62, 7 for 106, and a touchdown. And then the last guy in this tier is going to be DeAndre Hopkins going up against the Raiders. This is a very, very weird situation here for D-Hop. It seems like the Chiefs are kind of trying to keep his snaps down to potentially avoid having to pay a higher pick in that trade with the Titans. In week 12, he only had a 45% route participation, which is very, very low. Like that's like half the routes of a true like starting stud wide receiver, but he's still kind of producing 5 for 35 and a touchdown. The Chiefs are top 3 in implied point total this week. I do think they're going to score against the Raiders. So even if the usage isn't ideal, he's still getting targeted. He's a touchdown threat. I could see him like being in between this like tier 5, tier 6 area. I gave him the nod in tier 5, but it is very close. I think he's a mid-tier wide receiver 3. And then the final tier here, tier 6, going to start off with Cedric Tillman. Now he's still in concussion protocol. We don't know what his status is going to be, but in his last 4 full games, he's averaging 18.6 PPR points per game. He's been balling out, like I talked about with Jerry Jeudy. Jameis is feeding these guys, even in a not-so-great matchup. And then after Tillman, we finally had the return of Jalen Waddle. I mean, the dude looked like dust. Ever since week 1, he had not hit 10 PPR points. It was excruciating to have him on your team because he's good enough where you don't really want to cut him, but he's almost impossible to trust in your lineup. He went out in week 12, 8 for 144 and a touchdown. Now, I hope this is something that's going to like springboard him moving forward, but I can't say I'm all the way back in. I mean, he's my wide receiver 33. Is he playable? Sure, but would like to see some consistency before, he's jumping into like my top 30. After Waddle, going to go with Jawan Jennings going up against the Bills. I do not think Brock Purdy is going to play this week, just based on like the Vegas lines I've looked at. The 49ers are like sub 20 implied points. That leads me to believe that they do not think Brock Purdy is going to play in this one. So this ranking is assuming that there's no Brock. Week 12, he was fine, 5 for 40. It's just that his floor and ceiling are going to be much lower if Brock Purdy is not in the lineup. Then I have Jaden Reed going up against the Dolphins. After a very hot start to the season, especially with Jordan Love at quarterback, he's really fallen off over the last few weeks. He has scored under 10 PPR points in 4 of his last 5 games. It's also a bad matchup here against the Dolphins. Vibes definitely are not great here with Jaden Reed. Then I have Michael Pittman going up against the Patriots. I am not expecting Josh Downs to play this week. He's week to week with a shoulder injury. Seems like a long shot to play here in week 13. Week 12, even though Pittman had kind of been rough as of late, was targeted 7 times, caught 6 of them for 97 yards. I think he's going to have more locked in volume with no Josh Downs in the lineup. At my wide receiver 37, I'm going to go with Jordan Addison going up against the Cardinals, and he's starting to string together some nice performances. 15 plus points in 3 of his last 4 games. Week 12, he went 8 for 162 and a touchdown. By far his best game of the season. I talked about it with Jefferson, right? The defense put a lot of pressure on Jefferson. You see Addison, Hawkinson go out, have the big games. Not sure, if that's going to carry over here into week 13, but I do think he's playable in like this fringe wide receiver 3 area. In that same matchup, I have Marv. He's the wide receiver 40 in points per game on the season. He's been very boom or bust. Unfortunately, there's been a lot more of the bust games than there have been the boom games. He has 6 games under 8 points. He has 5 games with 15 plus. So he is still, has the opportunity to go for a big game here against the Vikings, but there's just not a very high floor, and the consistency just has not been there. Then I have Brian Thomas Jr. going up against the Texans. I'm expecting no Trevor Lawrence in this game. If Trevor Lawrence does play, I would have Brian Thomas Jr. way higher than this. It's just that the games with Mac Jones have not looked super encouraging. 13.6, 3.2 PPR points for BTJ when Mac is at the quarterback position. And then the last guy is going to be Keenan Allen going up against the Lions. It's a decent matchup for wide receivers. Week 12 was his best game of the season, 9 for 86 and a touchdown. Caleb Williams has looked much better with Shane Waldron gone. And then I'll just run through some honorable mentions. I think Tank Dell, Amari Cooper, Devon Vele, Deebo Samuel. These are guys that could have filtered in towards the bottom of these rankings. But thank you all for stopping by. If you enjoyed the video, do me a huge favor, hit that like button, subscribe. If you guys stayed till the end, I will say I'm not going to have like the later in the week updated rankings traveling for Thanksgiving. Hope you guys enjoy your time with your family if you do celebrate, but just wanted to throw that out there. Thank you all for stopping by, and I will see you in the next one.